Hey Caterpillar, welcome back. If you are new here, welcome. Shout out to all the new subscribers. I see you. Let's keep going. In part 5 of our series, we'll cover a crucial skill most women of childbearing age needs to be able to do, and that is calculating your cycle length. Now, this skill is particularly important if you experience chronic symptoms throughout your cycle or if you just have an irregular cycle. Understanding your cycle length helps you to empower and to plan any significant life events that may be occurring, whether it's starting a family, attending a wedding, or going on vacation. Knowing when your period will arrive helps you to avoid any inconvenient timing. After all, who wants to be on a well-deserved vacation during their period? Now, if this sounds like something you're interested in learning more about, please keep watching, and as always, the information in this video is intended for educational purposes. Please speak with your healthcare provider before making any changes to your lifestyle. Again, if this is your first time here, I recommend watching the other videos in this series to gain a better understanding of the topics we've covered so far. But in part 5 of this series, we'll focus on manually calculating our cycle lengths. So of course, there are apps that can do this. However, it's important to understand the process, as this will help you to identify any changes that may be occurring. We will also emphasize the importance of understanding the cycle lengths and introduce you to a useful tool that most functional nutrition practitioners will use to identify potential issues throughout the menstrual cycle. Specifically, in today's video, we're going to be talking about the Dutch test. Hi Caterpillars, let's talk about irregular cycles. But before we talk about irregular cycles, let's just briefly remind of ourselves what is a normal cycle. A normal cycle is anywhere from 21 to 35 days, with 28 days being the average. On our screen, we see a hypothetical irregular cycle, and the calendar shows the different phases of that cycle. So we know that the first 13 days of the cycle is called the follicular phase. And in the follicular phase also consists of your period, meaning the day your period actually starts, which is the first day of the follicular phase when bleeding occurs. And that is normally 13 days. But in this scenario here, we see that this particular person, the follicular phase, which is depicted in red, is actually 16 days. So this person has an extended follicular phase. It's longer than what is considered to be the average, which is around 13 days. And that could be because this person has a longer than normal period, which lasts around 18 days. Okay, as is depicted here on the screen. This particular period lasted 8 days. After someone goes through the follicular phase, ovulation should occur. And on an average or normal menstrual cycle, 28-day cycle, that happens around day 14. But in this particular scenario, this person is ovulating, on day 17, and followed by ovulation is the luteal phase, which should last around 14 days. But in this particular scenario, in purple, we're seeing this is about 8 days, which then leads to the beginning of a new cycle with the start of the period on the 26th. So this scenario is kind of showing this person is having almost like 2 periods in 1 month. And that can happen if you have an extended follicular phase and a shortened luteal phase. As we see here, the luteal phase is shorter than 14 days. It's actually even shorter than 10 days, which shows like a luteal phase defect, which is something we discussed in a previous video. So before we move on, let's just briefly talk about what is considered abnormal period. So if your period, again, is less or shorter than 21 days, that's considered to be abnormal. If your luteal phase is less than 10 days, that's also considered to be not abnormal. As we see here, this is an 8-day luteal phase. If you've missed 3 periods in a row, that's considered to be abnormal. If your period lasts longer than 7 days, that can also be considered to be abnormal. If your period is accompanied by severe pain, cramping, nausea, or vomiting, that can also be considered an abnormal menstrual cycle. If you have bleeding, spotting between periods, maybe you've gone through menopause and you're still experiencing some bleeding, or maybe after intercourse you experience bleeding, that's also considered abnormal. If you soak 1 napkin or 1 tampon within an hour, that's also considered to be abnormal. Okay, and now that we've identified what is considered to be an abnormal menstrual cycle, let's move on to actually calculating our menstrual cycle length. Okay, so let's calculate. So what are you going to need? You're going to need a calendar to track your cycle. You're going to need a calculator to count the period lengths of at least 3 months. And you're going to need the dates of when your period started. So you're going to need at least three dates to be able to do this. So let's start off. So we're going to start with June. And in June, our period started on day 30. Okay, so our first date we have is day 30, which is day 1, which is the day of menstrual bleeding. In July, we noticed that our period started on day 28. So what we're going to do here, to be able to calculate our cycle length, we're going to count from the day 30 of June, which is the first day of that cycle, and we're going to count up until day 27. Why are we counting up until day 28? Because day 28 represents a new cycle, and we want to capture the length of the previous cycle. So day 28 will not be included in the count. It has to be the day prior to the start of the new cycle. So the day 30th, day 1 of menstrual bleeding, up until day 27, the day before the next menstrual cycle begins, or the day before bleeding occurs again, is considered to be one cycle, and we're going to count the days in between the 30th and the 27th, and we end up with a 28-day cycle. So let's keep going. Then from July, we're going to realize that our next period began on day 31. So we're going to count the days from day 28th of July 2023 to the 30th of August 2023. And we're going to count the days between the 28th of July to the 30th of August. And we're going to see that we have roughly 34 days. So in our first cycle length, we had 28 days. And in our second cycle length, we had 34 days. So let's keep going. So in September, our period started again on day 29, which means we're going to count from day 31 of August to the 28th, the day before the new cycle starts in September. And counting between those two dates, we see we have 29 days. Okay, so what we're going to do in order to be able to get our average cycle length, we're going to count the cycle lengths that we have. Of course, if you have more dates available to you, please go ahead and count the days in between, and you can add more cycles. What you're going to do, you're going to add all the days together. So we're going to add 28, we're going to add 34, and we're going to add 29 together, and we get a total of 91 days. So between the 3 cycles, we have a total of 91 days, and we're going to divide that by 3 because we have 3 separate cycles. If you had 5 or 6 cycles, you calculated, then you could divide by 5 or 6. So how many ever cycles you've calculated for, you'll divide by that number. You add the total days together and divide by that number of cycles. So in this particular scenario, we have 3 cycles. So we've added the 28 days, we've added the 34 days, and 29, we got 91 days. And we're going to divide it by the 3 cycles, and we get a roughly 30.33 days, which is going to average out around 30 days. So if you only had those 3 cycles to compare, you assume that your cycle is roughly 30 days, which is actually considered to be normal, because remember, a normal cycle is anywhere between 21 days and 35 days. So in this particular scenario, this person has a normal cycle because it falls within the range. Of course, if your cycle falls less than 21 days or more than 35 days, then that would be considered to be abnormal. Okay, so let's move on. So the importance of understanding your cycle. So it's for reproductive health. So an irregular cycle or a consistently short cycle may indicate an underlying health issue that can affect your ability to conceive. That's something that you're interested in. Predicting ovulation. Knowing your cycle length allows you to predict when you've ovulated. and understand what's happening for crucial family planning, whether you are trying to conceive or whether you're trying to avoid getting pregnant. And thirdly, understanding your cycle length helps you to monitor and detect any early irregularities. So monitoring your cycle length helps you to identify changes or irregularities in your menstrual cycle. And once you've recognized those changes, it's now upon you to seek medical advice from your healthcare practitioner to help you work through those issues, okay? The Dutch test. So what is the Dutch test? Well, the Dutch test is an acronym which stands for Dried Urine Test for Comprehensive Hormone. It's a specialized test, laboratory test that is used by functional nutrition and functional medicine practitioners to help in identifying hormone levels and the metabolites that are created in the body. Okay, so why should you as a civilian care about the Dutch test, and how can the Dutch test help you? Well, the Dutch test can help your healthcare provider identify certain symptoms that you may be experiencing and why you may be experiencing those symptoms. So symptoms that can be identified or symptoms that can be illuminated by doing the Dutch test is if you're experiencing fatigue or low energy levels, if you have mood swings, or maybe you have some emotional disturbances that we talked about in our last video, if you're having any menstrual irregularities like we're talking about right now, if you have any sleep problems and insomnia, and that's specifically the part of the test that covers cortisol, because having high levels of cortisol on a night will definitely prevent you from falling asleep and allow you to experience some insomnia. So that is also a section of the test that's covered. We're not going to talk about it today, but it is also covered on this particular test. If you have any low libido, or if your sex drive is non-existent, if you have any weight management issues, any menopausal symptoms such as hot flashes, night sweats, and mood swings, that can be identified on the test. If you're having any skin issues or acne, that can also be identified on the test. If you're experiencing hair loss or excessive hair growth, that is something that could potentially be provide you answers by doing those tests. If you have adrenal fatigue or burnout, so just to touch on the adrenal function, your adrenal glands are two glands that sit above both each kidney, and the why I'm bringing it up is because the importance of the adrenal gland in what we're talking about here in this particular series. As a woman moves further and further from her fertility, and as she moves closer and closer to menopause, she no longer produces as much estrogen, because of course the follicles are not being produced, which doesn't lead to the estrogen production. Now once that starts to happen, what occurs is that the adrenal glands, which again sits above your kidneys, they tend to support this process or support estrogen production. So they will produce some estrogen. Of course, that estrogen production is nowhere near to what the ovaries were producing, but they do produce some estrogen which can support a woman as she goes through menopause. However, when as a woman, or an individual, could be a man as well, when they have adrenal burnout or what is called adrenal fatigue, the adrenal glands may not be able to produce the estrogen that would be expected them to produce. Though they don't produce as much estrogen as the ovaries, they are expected to produce some estrogen. And you can see if someone is experiencing adrenal fatigue and they're not able to produce that estrogen, a woman who is going through menopause is going to have a very difficult time. Okay, so if you're going through menopause and of course you're not producing as much estrogen for your ovaries, and you're also stressed out of your mind, and you have a stressful life, and you're not supporting your adrenal glands, you may be experiencing significant menopausal symptoms because your adrenal glands are not supporting you throughout your menopausal journey. So just keep that in mind. If you're in that stage of your journey and you're experiencing some symptoms, the Dutch test, of course, can help you to identify what's happening with the adrenal glands and whether or not you need some support for your adrenal glands. Okay, so of course the test can also help you to see what's going on if you have PCOS, of course, infertility issues, and bone loss and osteoporosis. And I just want to quickly touch on that part as well, because there is also a section on the test which shows estrogen detoxification. And I can talk about this for days, but I'm not going to go too in depth with this, but on the test, it shows you 3 pathways that estrogen can take as your body is trying to detoxify. It's not just estrogen that goes through those pathways. It's anything your body wants to detoxify, but we're talking about estrogen and hormones right now. So there are three options for estrogen detoxification. There is a pathway that is less carcinogenic, meaning that you're gonna want most of your estrogen to go through that particular pathway. There's another pathway that is more carcinogenic, meaning it's I don't want to get too much into it, but it changes the DNA structure of the hormones, which can lead to cancers that are dependent on estrogen. And then there's another pathway, it's called the CYP3A4. And that pathway is a proliferative pathway. When I say proliferative, I mean that it helps things to grow. So for bone health, it's great for bone health because it helps to build bones. But things like fibroids or polyps, they will also grow as well. So if you have a lot of estrogen going on through that particular pathway known as the CYP3A4 pathway, then things like fibroids and polyps and certain cancers can also grow as well, though it's good for bones. So if that's something you'd like to learn more about, I would definitely like to talk more about it. Leave me a comment below. Let me know that you want me to talk about estrogen detoxification and the different pathways and what you should be looking at or should be paying attention to if you were to do a Dutch test. So let's keep going. Of course, estrogen dominance can also be identified on a Dutch test. Okay, but for the purposes of today, we will only focus on how the Dutch test can identify certain irregularities in the menstrual cycle. And just before we move on, let's just briefly talk again about the Dutch test. Okay, so again, I mentioned it's an at-home test and it's done during the luteal phase, meaning it's done during the second half of the cycle, meaning you need to know that when you've ovulated and therefore when the second half of your cycle is, so you can actually do this test. So if this is something like, oh my god, I definitely want to do this test, just know that it's important to know the different phases of the cycle, particularly the luteal phase, which is where this test, which is the part of the cycle this test actually tests for. But I hope that made sense. And finally, again, we just talked about why the test is useful. So let's go and let's talk about what we can expect to see on a Dutch test. If you were to do a Dutch test and you would like to see what those patterns could potentially look like. Again, so before we move on, I just want to quickly say that there are different types of Dutch tests, and it depends on what you're experiencing. It will determine which Dutch test that you'd want to do. If you have a normal cycle, a normal 28-day cycle, and you can pretty much set your activities based on knowing when your cycle will come, you won't need a cycle map. You just do the Dutch complete, which will only test the hormone to see where you might be experiencing symptoms. If you have no idea what's going on with your cycle, it comes, it goes, it stays 3 days, next time it stays 7 days, and you're unsure as to the different phases, what's going on, then a cycle mapping might be the best choice for you. So I just wanted to say that quickly before we move on. Okay, so irregular cycles. So we have 4 separate scenarios, I would say, appearing here. And the first one we see, we have a normal cycle. So why is it a normal cycle? Well, it's normal because what do we expect on a cycle? During the cycle, we expect to see high levels of estrogen and high levels of progesterone. Okay, so in this scenario here, on the dotted line, we see what is expected of estrogen. We expect estrogen to peak just before ovulation. So the line that is being pointed to right now is the higher range of what we should expect to happen just before ovulation. And the dotted lines below show the lower levels of what we would expect to still be considered to be normal. And in between those 2 dotted lines is what typically the client, or in this particular scenario, a hypothetical client, can expect to see if they have a normal cycle. They would see that estrogen rises and then it tapers off, resulting at the bottom to progesterone. Okay, so here we see the dotted lines again. We have the upper levels of what we expect progesterone to be like during a normal cycle, and then what is being depicted here by the arrow is the lower range of what we expect to be considered normal ranges during that phase. And in between those two lines, we see what is a pretty little surge of progesterone, what we expect to see once you've ovulated and that follicle has been converted into the corpus luteum. We see that here. Okay, so this is what a typical normal cycle would look like on a Dutch test. However, everybody's cycle is different, so and your cycle may not be as pretty as this, but so long as it follows this general elevation in estrogen, which is followed by an elevation in progesterone, it's all good. In our second scenario here, we see something that might be indicative of a luteal phase defects. And if this is your first time here and you haven't seen the rest of the series, I suggest you go back to the other videos, because we talked about luteal phase defects. So again, let's look at this cycle. So we see what we expect to happen with estrogen. Estrogen should have its peak just before ovulation, followed by tapering off, and then progesterone at the bottom should have its peak as well. We see here that there has been a surge in estrogen, so that's an indication that this person most likely would have ovulated. So we can expect ovulation to happen with this scenario because there's that surge in estrogen. However, we see that estrogen surge happens later in the cycle, more towards like what day is that? This can be around day 20, which is typically considered to be the luteal phase of a 28-day cycle, because the follicular phase, or the first half of the cycle, happens between days 1 and 13, with day 14 being ovulation and days 15 to 28 being the luteal phase. In this particular scenario, we see here that the person did ovulate, but they ovulated later in the cycle. Okay. Also, we see here that progesterone is barely made a blip. If you look at the two dotted gray lines, you can see that progesterone didn't even reach the lower levels of what is considered to be normal. So again, this is a good example of what a luteal phase defect might be, is that there is that elevation in estrogen and you're able to ovulate, but because something's going on maybe with that corpus luteum and there isn't that surge in progesterone, you don't have that robust production of progesterone. It's pretty much below what we consider to be normal in a situation like this. Also, if you were to look at the days of progesterone, you see days 20 to 26. That is actually a short luteal phase like we discussed earlier. So that person luteal phase will be shorter. So what does that mean in terms of you as an individual? So let's say this is you've ovulated, which is great, kudos to you. That egg got released, so you got pregnant, right? Maybe you did get pregnant. That's great, but what's going to happen in a situation like this? What most likely might happen, of course, nothing is a fact, but what you can assume that might happen in a situation like this is, though you may be able to get pregnant if that is something that you're interested in, the chances of you being able to maintain that pregnancy will be slim, because one, what is the purpose? Ask yourself, what is the purpose of progesterone? Well, progesterone's purpose is to help maintain that uterine lining after that egg has been fertilized and it gets implanted into the uterine wall. Once that happens, progesterone is supposed to maintain that lining until other factors come into play, and then you have in other external hormones doing what they're supposed to do during that time. If you don't have any significant or robust production of progesterone, that line is not going to be able to be maintained, and therefore you can have shedding of that lining prematurely. So if you have an implanted egg in the uterine lining, but progesterone is not able to maintain the lining, that is going to lead to your period starting and, of course, a miscarriage. Also, because the the luteal phase is so short, between 20 and 25 days, that's like what? That's about 7-8 days. That is too short of a period of time to be able to maintain that lining. Remember, an average luteal phase is about 14 days. It's about 2 weeks. So that gives the body time to start putting things in place to take over from the corpus luteum that's helping to maintain that lining. So yes, so this scenario is basically somebody being able to get pregnant but not able to maintain a pregnancy due to some form of defect during the luteal phase. And I hope I did a good enough job in explaining that. Let's move on to our third scenario. So what's going on in the third scenario? In the third scenario here, we see, did this person even ovulate? I mean, like, there's barely a blip with estrogen, right? Because remember, for ovulation to occur, there has to be that surge in estrogen, which leads to the release of the egg. And we can see where we suspect we would like for estrogen to be with the dotted line. It's supposed to be a robust production of estrogen, which is going to trigger that release of the egg. But here we see barely a little blip happening with estrogen. It's kind of towards the lower end of what we consider to be normal. So maybe they might ovulate, maybe they might barely ovulate, but let's look at what's happening with progesterone to really let us know what's going on. Well, progesterone is pretty much a flat line. Like, have you ever seen a movie where it's like, a flat line that's deaf? Well, yeah, there's no progesterone production, meaning that chances are there was no ovulation. Because remember, ovulation occurs once the egg gets released, and progesterone is only produced in any significant amount during the second half of the cycle, once that follicle has been converted to the corpus luteum to start producing that progesterone. And hence we see no progesterone, so chances are there was no ovulation. So just in a previous slide, I talked about the adrenal glands. Now, in a situation like this could be a scenario where someone is maybe approaching menopause, maybe they're in a perimenopausal state. You do see some estrogen production, and that could be coming from the adrenal glands that we talked about earlier, which kind of produces some estrogen as a woman goes closer and closer towards menopause. The adrenal glands kind of produces some estrogen. So it's not like there'll be no estrogen in the body, it's just that the ovaries are not producing as much estrogen as they used to during your most fertile years, and now the adrenal glands is producing some of that estrogen. But the adrenal glands can produce estrogen, but they can't produce progesterone, or they won't typically produce progesterone, which that is something that happens due for the mechanism of the follicle converting into the corpus luteum. So in this particular cycle, we can assume that either this person, there was no ovulation, or maybe this person is in a perimenopausal state, moving closer and closer towards the end of their fertility. And maybe you've had kids by now and you're good and that's okay with you. Maybe you haven't had kids as yet and you're like, oh my God, like I need to get on this. Well, yeah, you definitely need to get on this if this is something that you're interested in doing, having kids, going to your healthcare provider and seeing what's happening with the hormones and whether or not you can conceive, if that's something that you're interested in. Okay, let's move on. Lord, this video is too long. Let's move on to our final scenario here. We're seeing someone with a 40-day cycle. Now, again, we talked about a normal cycle being anywhere from 21 to 35 days. We know that already. What we are seeing here is that this person, or this particular scenario, they're experiencing almost an identical response to what happened in the normal cycle. We see the elevation in estrogen, which is great. That means ovulation has occurred, egg has been released. But importantly, what we're seeing toward the bottom with progesterone is that there's also a robust response, which is what we expect to see in a normal cycle. An elevation in progesterone, which leads to the release of an egg, followed by a robust production of progesterone from that corpus luteum. So this is actually a normal cycle, except that it's only delayed. It's longer in length. So if someone was trying to get pregnant, could they get pregnant? They definitely could. They just need to identify where those hormonal surgeries are occurring and use that information to help them to get pregnant. So yes, this is kind of abnormal in terms of it being longer than 35 days, but it actually follows a normal pattern of what we would expect to see from a normal cycle. Only the thing is that it's longer than 35 days. Okay, so I hope I did a good enough job to explain this. Again, just a quickly refresher, in the first scenario, we have a normal menstrual cycle. We see that elevation in progesterone followed by that response in progesterone. In the second scenario, you see a luteal phase defect. We have ovulation occurring, but we have a very minimal response in progesterone, which could lead to pregnancy, but not maintaining the pregnancy. Also, in a situation like this, because estrogen is higher than progesterone in that phase of the cycle, you could be experiencing some the effects of estrogen dominance we talked about in our previous video. In the third scenario, we see this person barely ovulated, barely any estrogen production, any spikes, so we don't anticipate that they've ovulated. Maybe they're in a closer stage of menopause, and therefore they're not really ovulating that much, but the adrenal glands is producing some estrogen, so it's been picked up by the test. And lastly, we see someone with a longer than normal cycle. However, they're still following what we would expect to see from a normal cycle. It's just been delayed throughout the cycle. And that is that. Okay, so we just discussed the different scenarios that could possibly be picked up on the Dutch test. Of course, there are multiple other scenarios that can present itself on the test. This is just a general idea of these certain things that can happen when you have an irregular cycle. The next video will most likely be our final video in this series, where we'll discuss menopause, and I'll probably just mention some ways in which we can support our menstrual cycle from a functional nutrition perspective, which after all, I'm a functional nutritionist. So I'm going to talk about nutrition, how we can use nutrition to help support us in the different phases of the cycle, and maybe what we can do to be able to support ourselves during menopause for those of you who are experiencing menopause. Okay, so that is all, folks. Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with me throughout this video. It's longer than I anticipated, but here, so thank you so much. And as always, I'll see you where at the edge of your comfort zone. And if you've learned anything here that you didn't know before, I recommend you go to Google and you do some research for yourself, just to get more acquainted with some of those topics or some of those things that I talked about. Okay, so as always, I'll see you next time. Bye.